it's a world that feels more peaceful, but more grounded, and people feel more connected to where they are. And I think one of the main things is that we don't see in that 2040 anywhere like the extremes of wealth and poverty we saw back in 2025. That those, one of the things that I remember that was I loved from during that time, because you can kind of look back and see there were key things that shifted it.
Rob Hopkins, very good friend of the podcast. Welcome back to Accidental Gods. How are you and where are you this beautiful summer's day?
Well, what a delight to be back here in these hallowed halls. I'm actually, normally I would say I'm in Totnes in Devon, but I'm actually speaking to you from my son's flat in Peckham in London, where we've come up for a couple of days because we're going to a gig tonight in London. So yeah, a bit of a change of scene.
It's amazing, isn't it? A gig tonight in London would be quite close to my idea of unadulterated hell. Every single word of that. But you love it, and that's great. I'm
Yeah.
so happy because you have just had a very taxing, I would imagine, but probably quite exciting few weeks. You've been, as far as I can tell, to Luxembourg, to the Hay Festival, to Hawkwood, which is for people outside the UK, a really beautiful community that runs quite big courses where you all get to go and live together for an amount of time. And now you're in London. So you've got a book that is coming out on, say again, the 14th of June,
17th of June.
17th of June, which will be a Thursday, and it's called, everybody on YouTube, you can see that this is glorious, and I have read it lots. This is a pre-production version, so the production version will look slightly different. It's called How to Fall in Love with the Future: A Time Traveler's Guide to Changing the World. And this is exactly what we need. You are imagining different futures, and you are finding all the other people who are also imagining different futures. So, with all that you've been doing recently up to the launch of this book, what leaps out? What's most alive for you at the moment, except the gig tonight? I don't want to talk about that.
Um, well, yeah, it's always lovely to see a copy of a book that you've written that someone has with all like tabs down the side, and that they're like really well
Scribbled
written.
notes.
That's kind of why I do this stuff, really. I'm kind of that generation that grew up just after punk, where school was so rubbish that we kind of had to educate ourselves. So all of that fanzine culture, and every record you get to the end of, you had a list of like 5 books you needed to go off and read. And I still kind of try and embody that culture in the books that I do. So hopefully by the time you get to the end, you've got like lots of things to read and to check out
Yes,
and explore.
yes.
Um, so yeah, so this book has now been uh, I guess it's a few months since I finished it, and it
You
went
were
on.
finishing it when we were talking in March, and I'm very impressed with your publisher that you were finishing it and it came out in June. That's a very tight publication
Yeah,
schedule.
well, I mean, for me, a book is always like a process is never quite finished. So
Mm.
even on the last day, I'm still like, oh, I've just heard this really. Can we get this story? And they're
Yeah, and
like,
your
no,
editor's
Rob,
no.
no, Rob.
That's the next
Okay,
book.
okay,
Save
that's what
it.
they've cut off, cut off. Enough now. So that's a good discipline. So yeah, so the book is, I guess, just to say a little bit about why I did or where it came from.
Yes.
I guess it was originally after I'd written From What Is to What If, that was about the radical imagination and why climate change demands that we reimagine everything and why we get so stuck. I saw a t-shirt a young woman was wearing on a Black Lives Matter protest in Washington, and it said, "I've been to the future. We won." And it gave me complete goosebumps. Like it was like nothing I'd seen for a while. I was like, oh wow, that's what it was just a real kind of head shift somehow. And it was a couple of weeks before the big one in London, the Extinction Rebellion event that was called the Big One. And they asked me to go up and speak. And it got me thinking about, well, I could just go up and do my usual, hello, I'm Rob, I'm from the transition movement, and this is what transition towns are doing, and we need to be more imaginative, and this is what the future should be like.
You make that sound really boring when actually it's really exciting. But still, it
Well,
was what
yeah,
you'd been
yeah.
doing a lot and
It's
could
what
probably
I've
do
been
without
doing a lot.
engaging your head. Yes.
Exactly. And then I thought, what would it be like if I gave the talk as a time traveler who had just come back from the 2030 that resulted from us doing everything we needed to do. And we had actually made it. Had been a successful transition. And it was incredible. And I was like sort of Marco Polo with some amazing narrative coming back and go, oh my God. And I thought, and so I went to my local hardware shop. I thought, well, what's a time traveler going to look like? So I went to the local hardware shop and bought like a hazmat suit, and I had this little like patch embroidered where you'd normally have like the NASA patch on a spacesuit, which is like Ed Hawkins' climate stripes, but Ed Hawkins' climate stripes that then just sort of start getting cooler again. And I thought, well, how would that be like as a like? Because normally you look at the climate stripes, that is not an image that cultivates longing. That's a image that cultivates terror. I'm like, how could we turn that into an image that cultivates longing for us doing something about it? Well, what would you know? So we had that, and then I online I ordered a cosplay space helmet, and then I headed up to London, and then I stood on this kind of soapbox little platform thing, and then I did this talk for about 10 minutes that was like, I've just come back from 2030, the 2030 that resulted from us doing, oh my God, you wait, you're going to love it. The bicycle rush hours. Oh, it's like this sort of river of bicycles. And people told me about the hangovers they still have from the parties that celebrated the collapse of BP and Shell in 2028. And there was this and there was that, and there was urban agriculture everywhere. And there was this moment about 7 minutes into this talk, Manda, where I said something like, and just telling you about it, having been there, just telling you about it, I feel really emotional. And I looked round the people who were like around me, and there were tears on people's faces, do you know? And I thought, this is really interesting. Like, what's happening here? That's really the spark of this book was like, what's happening here? And then a couple of days later, I was invited to Bristol to Ashton Gate Football Stadium to give a talk for an organisation called the British Association for Sustainability in Sport. So it was people, Premier League football clubs and the British Yachting Association, all sorts of people. And I did the same thing. Oh, I've just come back and da, 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 da. And the first question, this woman put her hand up and she said, Rob, when you were in 2030, were there lots of repair cafes there? And I said, well, before I answer your question, I just want to say I love that you have suspended disbelief to the point where it's as if I'd said, oh, I've just been in Paris last week. And you said, oh, Rob, can you recommend a good cafe? It's like there's something about it. And when I was doing the research about time travel and time machines, one of the things that really was fascinating to me was that until H.G. Wells wrote The Time Machine in 1896 or whenever it was, the idea that you could create something that would allow you to intentionally travel backwards and forwards through time to moments of your choosing had never occurred to anybody.
Mm.
Like
That we know of
Shakespeare,
in our
Jules
culture.
Verne, but yeah, in our culture, yeah, exactly. And there were books about people falling asleep and waking up in the future, but not. But as
Yeah,
soon as he wrote The Time Machine,
it was a thing. Yeah,
it's like, yeah, of course. And so there's something beautiful about it. And I read a book by James Gleick about time travel where he said, talking about time travel, it's like you sprinkle pixie dust. If I say this paintbrush is a time machine, you probably aren't going to go, Rob, can you explain the quantum dynamics of exactly how
uh,
that works?
I go, oh
Most people
yes,
go,
and I want
where
to
are we
go
going?
too. Yes, yes,
Where are we
fast
going?
forward. Yeah,
And that's kind of the magic of it. So one of the questions of the book is, what would our activism look like if we acted as if time travel was possible?
right.
That's kind of where I start from.
Beautiful. It's so glorious. And I have to say, Rob, I think a lot of people could have done this and they would not have given it the infectious enthusiasm that you bring. And there is something about your capacity to step into this and make it real that engages the people around you. So I really want to honor that
Thank you.
and to honor the clarity of the book because you talk about memories of the future and you have looked at the cognitive neuroscience, and we are going to talk, people, about exciting memories of the future that Rob has brought back from his time travel. But I want to look at the fact that if we imagine things and we imagine them in 3D and color and sight and sound, and we can smell the bicycle rush hour and hear the amazing bird song and see that the insects are back and taste the air that's not full of diesel fumes and is instead full of other new scents, our brain does not differentiate fact from fiction. And I think this is really important. Our brain doesn't differentiate fact from fiction at all. And so when others of our writing colleagues are busy writing their dystopic survival, a small group of plucky humans survives the inevitable apocalypse narratives, and they do it with the best of intentions. They really believe that if they write that, everybody will realize how bad it's going to be and they will change their behavior. And first of all, they don't give people an option of how to change their behavior, so they can't. And it locks yet another layer of things are going to be terribly bad into our brains that do not differentiate between fact and fiction.
Yeah.
And so this is why you and I are working on utopian things that not only create visions of a future, but show us how we can get there in ways that our brains can step through and it feels real. So talk to us a little bit about your explorations into cognitive neuroscience, because you have more depth and granularity than that
Yeah.
in the book.
Yeah. Thank you. So I spoke to quite a few different neuroscientists as I was doing that. And like, I'm not a neuroscientist, I'm when I'm doing that research, I'm very much coming at it from the same place that the readers are coming from, I think, And what's fascinating to me is like if we are imagining the future or if we are remembering the past, it's exactly the same processes that happen in our brain. Because when you're imagining the future, you're basically going to the sort of cupboards of your memory and looking through them for useful bits. And then when you assemble them in a kind of new and unique way, that's the imagination bit. So, Manda, if you've never been to Italy before, and I said, Manda, I'm taking you on holiday to Italy next week. What happens is your brain sends a message down to your memory and says, send us up the file with Italy written on it. And
Exactly.
everything you'd ever heard or seen about Italy comes up in that file.
Yes.
And then from that, your brain assembles a picture of gondolas and mopeds and pizza and whatever it is. And so if you're trying to imagine the future, and you just watch GB News all day, and you're trying to imagine a low carbon, more socially just, equal, beautiful future,
You don't
it's really
have the
hard.
bits. Your
The
jigsaw
cupboards,
is
the
missing a
cupboards are
lot of the
empty.
pieces.
There's
Yeah.
nothing there.
Yeah.
So it's like you're so it's kind of and I feel like at the moment, like so many people are going to their cupboards. It's part of the reason why people get so stuck because they go to their cupboards and there's nothing there.
Yeah.
Because all the stories that I share in the book, all the stories that I share on all the different things I've done for years in previous books and blogs and places I've been to visit where this stuff is all already happening and
Your entire
flourishing. And
podcast.
exactly, that was what the podcast was about. Yeah, exactly. People just don't know those stories.
Yeah.
And it was why in France there was that film Tomorrow that came out in 2015, Cyril Dion's film, which was like a 2 hour film of just solutions, right? Food, energy, economics, whatever. There's a whole generation of young people grew up with that film. They call them now in France Generation Demain, who grew up with that film, and it's kind of gave them a new North Star of where to go. So I see in many like how important it is that people have those stories. Because then what happens is that you're creating memories of the future. If you can, so what I try and do when I run workshops like the one I did at Hawkwood last weekend was you invite people to imagine the future. That's one thing. So you're using your kind of visualizing imagination to do that. If you then add in sound and you can play people recordings, like the field recordings from the future project I've been doing. Actually, I've been to the future. It sounds like this. I've brought you back actual recordings from the future. Oh, okay. And then you add in what Wasima Labic, who is an amazing activist in Berlin, who's created what she calls Muslim futures, and she coined this term sensual futuring. It's like the more we can make this multi-sensory. So an exercise I do on my workshops is called making sense of the future, where I give everybody a cup and I tell them they have 15 minutes. They can go to the forest, the kitchen, the garden, wherever they want to go, but making that cup a cocktail of smells that smells to you like that future smelt that you imagined. and then everybody comes together, like 35 people or whatever, and you have a cocktail party, and you go, and you have to give it a name because all good cocktails have names, right? And you have to go around and smell all these different things. And by the time that it's Rilke, the poet, said the future must enter into you a long time before it happens. And that's what this work is about. Like, how do we get this, help people create these memories of the future that are so sort of that you attach emotions to. That's the thing with smell is human beings can remember 10,000 smells and they can attach memories and emotion to each one of those smells. So if we can harness that. So the next time you're trying to imagine the future, a low carbon future, and you go to the cupboards of your memory, and in there, there's this bright, sparkly thing that you would associate with emotions of fun and connection because you did it with other people, and you laughed with them, and you included your smell and your taste and your feeling, and that's the bit for me that moves it beyond just like imagine your utopia. Like, who cares about utopias? Like, they're so far away, they're just pointless. And so what? And you don't know how to get there. And you normally need to depend on other people to get there. And actually, which is why I always focus on 2030, because people say, "Oh, Rob, that's not very far away. How come?" It's like, well, we have to focus on the 2030 because to have any chance of getting to where we need to, climate change wise, by 2050, we have to pass through that point of having cut our emissions by 48% by 2030. Otherwise, everything else just gets pushed out and it's all too late. And what's the point? So it's like, but for me, then it's like, well, what would that 2030 be like where we've cut our emissions by 48%? It's not going to look that different. We're not going to rebuild everything by 2030. But if that shift, that change was happening, how would it sound different? What would the look in people's eyes be like? What would it be like, feel like to live in a world where we could see our young people's mental health improving and biodiversity coming back?
What would it feel like? I think that's so important, is the felt sense of I wake up in the morning and the world is no longer on a heading off the edge of the cliff. It's building and growing, and I am an integral part of
Yeah,
feeling that the world is going to go somewhere that I would be happy to leave to my kids.
yeah,
People will cross oceans in a small boat if they think at the other side is a world that they could give to their kids that would be better.
beautiful. Yeah, exactly.
And so that
And the,
seems to me, how do you get on with people? Because it feels to me that we are at the point now, exactly as you said, we have to have 48% reduction in emissions by 2030, which starts with no wars. Let's tell everybody that you have to stop
yeah,
the wars because the
yeah,
CO2
please.
output for war is not been calculated because it's a state secret. As if the Chinese and the Russians might learn something from the CO2 output that you calculate from your military that they don't already know. I don't
Yeah,
think so. But nobody wants us to know because it's absolutely catastrophically huge.
yeah,
So, leaving that aside, if we can get the felt sense of that, then we can begin to shift. And I'm wondering, you now have you've just been to Denmark, where it sounds like you talked to loads of people. I want to hear a bit about that. You've been to Hay on Wye. You've talked to, I think it always feels to me that Hay, you may feel different, but I go to Hay and I think there's a lot of very earnest people talking about the system and not changing it. And I
yeah,
get quite cross with it. But you're there going, guys, we need a whole new system. This is not about tweaking the existing system. This is about fundamentally changing our relationship with power, our power inside and our power connections to each other and our connections to the more than human world. And how is this landing with people once they get that felt sense? We need to get to the point where they don't just do it in a workshop with you, they go back to their family and their friends and their colleagues and their workplace and they go, guys, I've been to the future, and what we're doing now is not how we get there. We do something different. Are you beginning to get feedback that this is happening?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I mean, I think that just one thing to say that I think is really important is, sometimes, there is so much uh, despair and despondency around at the moment. It's like the future is being cancelled, the future is being colonized, and a lot of people can't even see to the end of the week, never mind thinking about what the future might be like. And there's a guy called Luigi Vitali who I quote in the book who talks about how we have to uncancel the future. And he said, imagining the future is not naive, it's radical. It's like
Mm.
it's the only thing that is really going to get there. And the point I always say to people is, when people say, "Oh, it's very naive and idealistic," and it's like, um, and I've had that. I've been called naive since,
Since you started the
I
transition movement
yeah,
30 years
exactly.
ago?
Well, and
Yeah.
actually, I always say to people, well, I wrote the Transition Handbook in 2008, right? That book, the book that sort of launched the transition movement. That book said we need to urgently break our relationship with fossil fuels because it's a huge vulnerability, and we need to break that, and we need to be building more resilient local economies. Actually, what happened instead was that the European Union sent Russia 18 billion euros every month for natural gas, at the same time telling us all that there was no money to do a Green New Deal, there was no money to decarbonize Europe. And then we got to the point where because of us sending Russia 18 billion euros every month, now Europe is saying we need to raise 800 billion euros to rearm Europe. It's like, okay, so now who was the naive one?
Yeah, yeah. Yes.
Now who was the naive one? So what I always say, like what I'm saying is, I'm not saying that we will definitely see in the next 10 years a radical and an urgent, profound transition that addresses all the different things. What I'm saying is, but we could,
Yes.
and if we
And
don't keep
frankly, if we
that,
don't,
and if we don't,
if we're missing a lot of targets that are going to see us straight through to 10 degrees C of warming, which
exactly,
is not survivable by the
which
people
is
who
not
think they're still
survivable.
going to make
Even
money out of it.
like when I go to France, the French environment minister published this report recently about how France could adapt to 4 degrees of warming. I was like, there's
No,
no
no,
way
wait.
in hell. I'll save you the money and the time writing that
Yes.
report. It's not going to happen.
It's
It's
not.
already at 1.5 degrees and hundreds of towns are running out of
Yeah.
water and your crop yields are down. And do you know what I mean? It's like actually, yeah. So what I find when I do this work is that like it really touches people, I think, very deeply. And like you said, there's a kind of a posture to doing this work, and which I found a beautiful description of in which I use in the book, which was from a guy who was a biographer of Sun Ra, the amazing
Yes.
jazz artist who I love and who I write about quite a lot in the book, who he described as being an everyday utopian. Like his band, who always their story was that actually Sun Ra wasn't a human being; he was an angel from Saturn, and that the band regularly traveled through space, and they used space travel as a different way of framing debates about black liberation. They're like, well, if we can't be who we want to be here, maybe we can be who we want to be elsewhere in space. And I read a review of a gig that they did in the 80s where someone said that Sun Ra's band looked like a nativity play where everyone had come dressed as the three kings. But the thing was that they most of them lived in the same house together, and they were and but it wasn't like a stage costume. They dressed like that to pop
All
down
the
to the
time.
corner shop to buy some milk or to go
Yeah.
to the laundrette.
Yeah.
And he described them as being everyday utopians. It was like that was kind of who they
Yeah.
were. And he described Sun Ra as having an unshakable certainty and deadpan humor.
Cracking.
And so when I started
Right.
looking around in the
Right.
book with this idea of, well, who else is using this kind of idea of time travel or like temporal fluidity? Two of the people who are, I think, brilliant work they're doing on this is Rashida Phillips and Mother, who run this project called Black Quantum Futurism in North Philadelphia, where they talk about time travel as a kind of a tool for Black liberation, and they pull in quantum physics and science, uh, Black liberation, Afrofuturist narratives and storytelling, and they talk about time travel, but it's completely it's like it's not a joke. It's not
Mm.
like Boney M sort of we travel through space, la la. It's like we built a time machine.
Right.
And I'm
Absolute certainty.
and the way I do it is the same. It's like I come from Totnes. We've
Yeah.
built the world's first fully functioning time machine in a secret laboratory underneath Totnes Castle. And I've got evidence. Look, here's some photos of us, and here's us doing that. Any more questions? Right. Okay.
Oh,
Now we can
now I'm
go.
going to
Where
tell
are we
you what we've
going?
seen.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. And so there's a kind of There's a
Absolute certainty and
playfulness to
deadpan
that.
humor, and you've got that.
Yeah.
Yes,
And
yeah,
so that's kind of where that comes from. So what I find is that it really, so what I'm not saying is, okay, all everybody doing activism around climate, around social justice, around indigenous rights, everything needs to throw everything up in the air and start pretending they're time travelers, right? But actually, what the book is saying is that I think there's something that we often miss, and that particularly in the climate movement, we jump so naturally to narratives of collapse and extinction. And what's happening right now is the way the far right are rolling is that they just paint terrifying visions of the future and then position themselves as the strong men who'll protect you from those terrifying visions of the future. If what's happening alongside that is that progressive left-leaning people who understand climate science are also painting terrifying visions of the future. People are just caught between two sets of headlights. They don't really know where to turn. And that actually all great movements for change started with people saying "what if" and telling different stories. And
yes. It's the
and
telling different stories, and we're
yeah,
not. If we're all saying we're all going to hell, then you may as well try and line up behind the guys with the biggest guns because you might have a couple of extra days. It's
it
not a
becomes a
good narrative.
self-fulfilling prophecy, really.
Yes, yes,
So there is something as well, I think, in How to Fall in Love with the Future. What I'm sharing is kind of a journey where I feel like I've got from about A to D, and
right.
and that what the invitation is for people to step in
And
and help me
finish
along with
the
that,
alphabet.
you
Right.
know.
But you're stepping in a way, I think you've not gone from A to D, you've created a new alphabet. And I think this is one of the things that I think you get across really well in the book and that we need to get across more is no problem is solved from the mindset that created it. You don't say that, I'm saying that, but that's where we're at. This is not about tweaking the current system. This is
No,
about going, guys, we created a whole new system. Look, this is what it looks like. And here's how we got there. And this is what it feels like. And these are the places in the world where this component of this is already happening.
yeah,
And this is what you're saying. The future is already here. It's just very unevenly distributed. I can't remember
yeah.
who said that. You'll know that.
William Gibson.
Thank you, William Gibson. Um, and that's the key is we've got to stop imagining the existing future. When I get hooked into political discussions on the left, they're all basically tweaking the existing system. If we all voted Lib Dem and Green, we could do this. Guys, I'm sorry, we don't have time because actually, if we don't have significant change, systemic change by 2030, all the people talking about disaster are going to be right. It's a very short time frame, and I think this is one of the things that your book gives us. It seems to me that people listening to this podcast must be on board with this by now. It has to become the single most important thing any of us does. It has to become the driving light of our life. And yes, there are people for whom just feeding the kids is a massive problem and their priority, and that's not an accident. The system is set up. You said way back, predatory capitalism is a disimagination machine. You said that in What Is to What If. Um, you didn't call it predatory capitalism, but basically, capitalism is a disimagination machine. It is designed to suppress creativity and to keep us scared and to stop us seeing beyond the end of the next week. There was a report in The Guardian last week that over half of Britain is living basically at the point where they got a bill for £100, their entire financial life would fall over. And meanwhile, there are billionaires, and this is not a sustainable system. You can't. It will fall over. The levels of private personal debt to government debt ratio is way over the one that created the global financial crash in 0809 when you were setting up Transition Network and writing your original books. The system is going to fall over. And therefore, what we need is what you've done, which is, guys, there's a whole different system. If every single one of us committed to building that whole different system and just walked away and left the old one, the new one would be there. We just need to understand, and we have a tiny window of time, it seems to me, where we can use the energy, the fossil fuels, the materials that we actually have at the moment, and throw them all at the new system. And that isn't naive. That's the would you like complex life to continue? Or are you happy with the sixth mass extinction? I think one of the things that people forget is mass extinctions before took millions of years. millions of years to get to 75% loss of life, which is basically what's left of the single cells. There's a lot of single cells around that continue. And you know, a few odd, really, really interesting sharks at the bottom of the Marianas Trench, and everything else is extinct. And it took millions of years, and we're doing it in less than a century. And that's because a whole bunch of people are going, oh, it's naive to imagine anything else. Go, no, I'm sorry. Or let's plan for 4 degrees of warming. It's no, have you any idea of the tipping points that will be happening by 4 degrees of warming? 4 degrees, it won't just stop at four. From four, you get to 10 very fast, and nobody is surviving 10 degrees of warming.
And Morgan Stanley wrote a report the other day where they said, well, 3 degrees is inevitable now, but on the upside, it'll create a 41% increase in demand for air conditioning. Did you see that?
No.
Yeah, seriously.
Okay, that is functionally insane.
Somebody actually sat and wrote that. But it is this like, I remember in the run up to the election, Wes Streeting wrote an article in The Guardian where he said, the only thing worse than no hope is false hope. It's like, really? Are
Right.
those the options you're giving us, Wes? How
Yeah.
about some hope, mate? How
Okay,
about you
this
give
is
us
the
a bit
guy
of
who's selling the
actual hope?
NHS to Palantir to Thiel. So we're not
It's just
giving him a lot of
horrendous.
credibility.
But it is like, so there was one of the people I interviewed in the book was Peter Kalmus, who's a
Yes.
fantastic climate scientist,
Yes.
right?
In the
Because,
US.
yeah,
He's
in the US, and
probably
he's
being
one of
shipped
those
to El
climate
Salvador as we
scientists.
speak.
Yeah, so he's one of those climate scientists who is not content to just sit around and write papers. He's been arrested twice. He glued himself to the Chase Bank because they're still the biggest investor into fossil fuels. And
And he moved from California to Carolina
yes,
because
and
he
then
could see what was coming.
yeah, well, because he thought he could see the fires, and then 2 years later, he sat in his lounge in his new house and watched his old house burn down on national television. Yeah, because I was like, okay, I want to just check: is writing a book called "How to Fall in Love with the Future" hopelessly naive in the face of the climate science? That was my starting place. I thought I don't want to publish a book. All the climate scientists are going to go, Rob, you're living in cloud cuckoo land, mate. What are you talking about? Have you read any of the science, right?
Right.
So I had this long conversation with him, and part of that was that I said, okay, as a climate scientist, you quite rightly, your focus is to point people to the graphs on the chart that do that. This is
And for
going to be
people who can't see it, that's the upward tick of
yes,
the
I'm pointing.
hockey stick curve.
I'm acting out an upward curve.
Yep.
In terms of well, this is where we're going if we don't do anything, right? Business as usual scenarios, and we need those because that's where we're heading, right? But what we never really hear from them is, well, what's the best case scenario, right? What
Yes.
is there a scenario in which we stay under 2 degrees and we're able to then bring it back down again? And he said, yeah, there is. Like in the models that he creates, that is one of the scenarios. And he calls it emergency mode. He said emergency mode is that we is the rapid phase out of fossil fuels, the rapid dismantling of industrial meat system. And so for me, the reflection of that is okay. So there is a route, but emergency mode is a terrible name for it.
Yes.
It's rubbish. Who's
Yeah.
going to go, hey, let's go into emergency mode? But if we called it like, I don't know, delicious transition mode or something, and if we could tell the stories about what that would be like, what kind of imagine. So yeah, imagine we phase out the industrial meat system within 10 years and replace it with something phenomenal instead. Like, how do we tell the stories
Yeah.
about the people who did that? Like, I remember there was that program on Netflix that was called You Are What You Eat, which was about sets of twins who one of them had took an omnivore diet, one of them took a plant-based diet, and they measured them over 8 weeks, and they put in all these little stories. And one of them I always remember was about this guy who raised chickens in the US for Purdue, and they would send in the chicks. He paid for all the infrastructure. They sent him the food and the chicks, and he raised like millions of chickens in these awful
In
sheds.
Chicken Auschwitz. Yeah.
And chicken Auschwitz, and it made him ill. It made the chickens ill. He was miserable. He was getting further and further into debt. And one day he was just like, "I'm done with this." And in the program, but he's like, "But I've got all these sheds. I've built all this infrastructure." And in the program, he was converting that whole infrastructure to growing mushrooms, to growing oyster mushrooms, to
Ah,
growing all
clever.
these and was so much happier. And it's like
And not as sick.
stories and not as sick. So it's like that how we message that is really important. how do this we engage storytellers and musicians and poets and songwriters in telling stories about what
Yes.
emergency mode would be. And there was at the end of the interview, and I didn't include this in the book because the editor said you can't include this because it looks like you basically just rung him up to ask him to blow smoke up your ass. But I said to him like, I'm writing this book on how to fall in love with the future. What do you think? Is that a good idea or is it hopeless naive? He said, I think it's awesome.
Was this Peter Kalmus
Yeah,
said that?
he likes to swear. He swears quite a lot. He said, I think it's awesome.
I think we might
And I
have to
was like,
bleep that out
okay,
actually, Rob. But anyway,
sorry.
can you say that again with the expletive deleted just in case we have to bleep it out?
Okay.
Because
And I and I said, what do you think of that? And he said, I think it's F star 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 ing awesome. And
yay.
that was a real moment for me because I
Yeah,
was like, okay, so that
that's
so yeah,
worth
so
it.
the editor said you can't put that in because that just
It sounds like Peter Kalmus is giving you
sounds
a
like you're just
preemptive
saying
push for the book,
exactly.
but he
But
is.
actually, it felt really it
Yes.
was a real moment for me in this process, and why don't we do that more? And
Yeah.
we need those stories, yeah.
And we need them, and somehow we need to supplant the other stories. And so I'm still really interested in tell us a little bit about Denmark. Did you get onto national television, national radio, national anything? Did Denmark notice that you were there? Because Denmark always strikes me as being, I don't know, Scandinavia has that feel of being more progressive, and then I discover it's actually full of neo-Nazis, just like everywhere else. And it used to be really progressive, and it's not nearly as progressive as it was. But there are islands of hugely progressive people.
Yeah.
Tell me a bit about
Well,
Denmark.
yeah, so I was there for a few days and I'd been there before. I was there about 6 months before and did a massive so the city hall is the main public building there. And when I was there before, we did an evening talk uh, where there was, I don't know, 300 people or something. And we turned City Hall into a time machine and took them all to 2030. And it was just a beautiful, magical thing. So I was there. I ran a training with an organization there. I did a book launch. We did a public event. Yeah, I think and what we've and also I spoke at a conference, an international conference of chefs, which I hadn't quite clocked when I went what it was. Like when I left, my wife said, "What are you going to speak at?" I said, "Oh, it's some chef thing." Actually, it turns out it was like TED Global for and 700 people go, but more than 4,000 people apply, and you have to send like an A4 page saying why you feel you should be there. And I did my full like wearing my time travel costume. I've been to the future and got them all time traveling and talked about why it was so important that the role that chefs played and the role that the food industry made in making that happen. It didn't happen by accident. They led this and people loved it. And actually, what we're planning as a result of both of those trips is at the end of September and early October, we're planning a 3-day festival of the future in Copenhagen City Hall, with us bringing the full field recordings from a future time machine, with Ruth Bentovim doing Town Anywhere, with Kate Rayworth doing Donut Economics Circus, which she does now. So, and we need to get you to come and do utopian storytelling stuff as well. And it's going to be rather magical. My sense is that there is a kind of that, like anywhere, there's people feel really stuck, and maybe there's a different approach which brings people together. Part of the call of the book is what we need now is like a positive futurism movement, and you can see bits of it already in different places. And my hope is it needs to coalesce. And also the thing that's interesting in Copenhagen is that in November they have city elections, and for the first time, it's been governed by social democrats for a long time, but there's a sort of a green sort of ecological coalition who are very, very close. And so the question is, if you open a time portal in a major European city 2 months before an election, and you show what it looks like, and you get lots of people through, and you engage storytellers, and also what happens when you open a time portal in a you we're taking people through a tear in time into 2030, but also maybe there's things that sort of escape back through that tear in the time portal and start popping up around the city that nobody quite expected. And do you know what I mean? So it's I feel like Copenhagen is really ripe for a lot of this stuff. Copenhagen is one of the few cities now in the world where you can just go swimming in the harbor because they've cleaned it up to that extent, and the cycling infrastructure there is just incredible. And I first went there when I was 25 and at university, and we went on a field trip to Denmark, which at that point was way ahead of everybody else in terms of renewables and energy efficiency and all that sort of stuff. Um, yeah. So it feels like there's something, in the book. What I did was I started looking around and saying, well, what if we had a kind of a revolution that was based on activism that was more playful with time, kind of a temporal fluidity approach to activism. And then the more I started looking around, there were all sorts of really curious, quirky people already doing some amazing stuff. And when you pull them all together and go, but look at all of these,
Yes,
it's really,
that's what
really
gives the
interesting.
book its punch, is this is already happening. Tell us a little bit about Town Anywhere. It's on my note. I've got so many notes, but that was one of the notes, was tell us about that.
Town Anywhere is for me one of the great time travelers practices developed by my friend and colleague Ruth Bentovim, who lives in Totnes too, who has years and years of work doing community arts practice. She's a genius at that stuff. And she developed initially in 2013. It was called Transition Town Anywhere, and it was a big activity that we did in Transition Network conference that we did at Battersea Arts Centre in 2013 with 350 people, where we built. So the idea is that you start by time traveling to the future, and you physically step. You come into a big room, and there's a ribbon which is like keeps everybody just in the first little bit. So you all kind of penned into the first little bit, and she explains that the rest of that room is 2030 or 2035 or wherever it's set for that event. And then you count up through the years 2026, 2027, 2028, 2029, and then she lets the ribbon go, and you all walk through in silence into that space. And then you go through this series of activities where you meet one person, and then you meet more people, and then you kind of organize at a street level, and then you go through this process of like, so what are you doing in that future? Like, what's your role? What are you making? What's your life like? And then you meet other people who share that interest, and together you plan something that you're doing in that future. And then the brilliant bit then is that you literally build it with cardboard boxes, big cardboard boxes, and bamboo canes and sticky tape and string and pens and newspaper, and you build this three-dimensional world that you then inhabit for about 3 hours, and you trade in it and you celebrate in it and you grieve in it and you dance in it and you go around and you see all the different things that are doing, and you make connections with all those different things. And to be with 100, 200, 300 adults playing in a play future that you have dreamt together, that you can see and touch and feel, is one of the most extraordinary magical things. And there's a kind, and then at the end you step back and you count back 2030, 29, 2028, 2027, 26, and you go back behind that line again, 2025, and you look out into the room, and the future, which at the beginning of that exercise had just been empty, that future is now full of stuff and experience and joy and love and structures and things, and it's a very powerful, emotional, moving thing. And I remember the first time I did it, I ended up with some people where we had created a thing we called the Yeast Collective, that was a brewery and a bakery in the same building. I was like, if the future's worth fighting for, it's definitely got that in it. And I can still tell you like the names of the beers that we made and how our training program worked and everything like that. And the next year in my town, then we started a brewery.
I was going to say, Totnes now has that brewery. You made it
Well, it
happen.
did. It did. It
Oh,
unfortunately got killed by COVID and the energy price rises that followed the war in Ukraine.
darn.
But it ran for about 9 years and was a wonderful thing. But the spark of it came. from Town
Right.
Anywhere, and I've met so many people who the thing that they played that they then went on to create.
Right.
And yeah, it's a magical, amazing thing that she's brought into the world. And when I talked to her about it, and I interviewed her for the book about it, and she said that what she's trying to do is to give people an experience where afterwards they say, when I was in the future,
Yep. I did.
that's
Yes.
what I'm trying to do as well. It's like, and it's such a powerful tool for that.
Yes. And so you've got your field recordings from the future, which you're going to take, or sounds like around the world, but definitely around the UK and then Denmark and anywhere else that can have it. Tell us a little bit about that, because again, this is going to feed into people's experience of being able to step through that rift in time.
Yeah, so during the first lockdown, around that kind of time, I found I was listening to lots of ambient electronic music, which is something that was kind of new to me at that time, and I just loved it because I was because if there's beats or lyrics I can't concentrate, it demands all of my attention. That ambient music is this whole very wide amazing genre between kind of electronica and classical, and I can listen to it and I can work. And there were some artists who I was listening to who used field recordings in really interesting ways. There was in particular the guy from Norway called Biosphere, who he made one album that was just based on field recordings he made in nuclear power stations in Japan, which is an extraordinary piece of music. And he did his best album is called Substrata, and it uses fields. There's one which is basically one whole track is just a recording of an airplane at a high altitude just going over his house. And it's absolutely beautiful. I don't know, it's hard to describe. But he did field recordings in a way where I found it really affecting. And and it started me thinking, well, what if those field recordings were from the future? What if you found a way to bring those field recordings back? Because one of the big inquiries in how to fall in love with the future is what if the primary goal of our movements wasn't giving people enough information, but the primary goal was cultivating longing for a different future, right? And so, well, what if you could actually bring back recordings from the future and play them to people? Maybe that would be the thing that would, in the same way that, if you go on holiday to Italy and you have an amazing time, you show people your holiday photos, people are like, where is that place? I'm going there next year. If we could do the same with that. And then there was one particular piece of music that did that so beautifully by an artist called Mr. Kit, which at the end there's this bit that sounds like you're on a beach in Thailand or somewhere watching a firework display, and everyone's going, ooh, and talking to each other. And it has this feel of like community and awe and celebration. And you're there with them exactly. And I thought, if I did that project, I'd love to do it with that Mr. Kit guy, but I bet he's like impossibly cool and lives in Berlin or LA or and doesn't answer emails. And I looked him up and he lived in Totnes. He lived in Totnes, and he knew one of my kids. They used to DJ together on a rig that one of them had. And I met up with him for coffee and I said, "Look, I've got this idea." And he said, "I love it. Let's do it." And so we've done 8 pieces of music, and I go to visit places across Europe because I don't fly. So it's just within the sort of
Where you can get to by train and
train
bus.
radius here.
Yeah.
And I always take my Zoom recorder with me in my bag and make recordings as I go. And then with Kit, we've made 8 tracks so far. So there are things like the bicycle rush hour in the car-free neighborhood of the Vauban in Freiburg,
Underground
landscapes
mushroom farm.
underground mushroom farm in Brussels, landscapes rewilded by beavers, a regenerative farm where you can really hear the biodiversity coming back, a street in London where they're installing solar all down the street. And it's just such a lovely thing. And then from that, so that's actually coming out as a vinyl record next month, and
Woohoo.
I would
Vinyl
direct
records still
people.
exist.
They
That's a thing. Wow.
absolutely they do.
Okay.
Think up, Amanda. There's
I thought everything was digital these days.
no. The analog is back, baby, with a vengeance, and
Okay.
everybody's getting their record players out and buying vinyl again, and it's just
So you
fantastic.
can hear it when it jumps and the dog can knock it and okay, fair enough.
Exactly. And so we've done this beautiful double vinyl fold out sleeve with pictures from the future, and it's just a gorgeous thing. So we're doing a crowdfunder. If people search for crowdfunder field recordings from the future, you
Send
can.
me a link, I'll put it in the show notes. Yep.
Gorgeous. And then we made video pieces for each of the
You did.
thing, and then working with Tim Dollymore from the Media Workshop, we've created this Field Recordings from the Future live immersive show, which you came to the very, very
I
first
did.
public unveiling of, where we surround, it's like a structure that we build that can hold about 200 people, and you project the films 360 degrees around everybody and put speakers all around the edge. And it's quite a wonderful thing.
Yeah. And you have stepped forward into time. And
Yeah,
there must be, it seems to me, if we're trying to create so my basis is we have to create a movement. It has to be global. It has to cross all of the current cultural boundaries of age and race and gender and identity and there is none of those exist on a dead planet.
yeah,
Every single person now has to commit that this has to be how we make it. They have to be inspired. They have to have that yearning. In the book, you say there's people when you go to the European countries that you can get to by train, they have to translate that word of longing and yearning into the local language, and sometimes they seem not to have that. But there has to be something really bone deep. It has
yeah,
to be in the marrow and the mitochondria of your cells that you can feel a different way of being as possible and you yearn for it. And it's the single most important thing in the way that advertising gets us to yearn for, I don't know, a bigger car or a chocolate cake
cannot
or the
remember.
holiday
Right.
in Italy. This future has to be embedded in our DNA. And what
Yeah,
you're doing is creating, you've been there. I have been to that future. I have heard it. I have seen it. I think it became kind of interesting. We could introduce scents in there, but as in smells. But you've got that capacity to feel potential that is different. We've got to break. It feels to me that we're kind of like the end of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where people are locked in a concrete room. The dwarves are going round and round a concrete room, and the answer is inward and upward or something. I don't remember. But we're locked in this concrete room that capitalism gives us, and
yeah,
it's projecting all sorts of bright shiny things on the walls. So we're all staying there, and you and I and people like us are going, guys. There's a world out there that's much, much, much more fun than the concrete box where you're spinning on the hamster wheel and you're basically born to pay bills until you die.
yeah,
Come out and join us in a world where you get to live and build real relationships and have a sense of pride and belonging and being and becoming and all the things that give humanity meaning that isn't just another box from Amazon.
yeah,
And here's the door. Come and join us out here. And that longing for, yes, I can see the door, and yes, I can make it happen in my life now. And yes, it's hard paying the bills and feeding the kids. But I just need to start having conversations with people, and I have conversations with people, and they just need to be different.
yeah. That was after the at the end, because the course that I taught at Hawkwood was the first time I've really done the material that's in the new book as a 2-day
Wow.
immersive course.
Right.
So it was quite a leap because normally I do it as a 1-day thing. And so the feedback at the end of the second day was so interesting. People were like, I feel like I've been sort of rearranged on a kind of a molecular level.
Right.
Like
Right.
it's like I can see the kind of possibilities now, like I
Right.
feel like you've sort of you've pushed me out of the present,
Right.
and I feel like I can move more fluidly in time, and you know it's interesting. It's a when you were saying about that, about the world that we can create. It's when I was in Copenhagen, I went out one evening and I was chatting to this guy who said, "Oh, I've just written a book." I said, "Oh, I've just written a book too." So he said, "Oh, what's your book about?" So I said, "Oh, what's your book about?" So it's about the internet. And so I said, "Oh, is it about AI and all of this, that, and the other?" And he said, "No." And I said, oh, is it about, so I ran a few attempts at like, so is it about, and all the different things that concern me about the internet. He said, no, 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 it's just about how the internet is so boring. That's
You've written a
like,
book
the
about how
whole
the
book.
internet is so boring. He said,
He said, yeah, it's
okay.
just so boring. He said, when you think what life can be and what human beings are capable of, and how 99% of what's on the internet, apart from accidental gods, is just
And
so
everything you do.
dreary. And,
Right.
and and I was like, okay, I didn't see that coming, but that's just fantastic.
Is
What a
it
great
in
note.
is it in Danish? Do we have to get a translation of this
Well,
book?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean, but it's like there was that poll a couple of weeks ago that said that nearly half of young people would prefer to live without the internet. So interesting.
Yeah.
Because it's not the narrative we get at all, is oh, they're on
No.
their phones all the time.
No.
It's like, yeah, but actually, more than half of them would just rather just turn it off. Just turn it off.
Yes. 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 It's
All this
interesting,
stuff,
isn't it?
and how Sam, what's he called? Sam Altman is now in Silicon Valley trying to raise $1 trillion for the next iteration of AI.
Oh,
But there's no
GPT.
money for
Yeah.
climate.
No,
Yeah.
quite.
And
No.
all those same narratives, well, we have to be at the front of this because it's a race. We need to be at the front, and time is of the essence. All those same arguments you can make about tackling the climate emergency, but actually tackling the climate emergency actually takes you to a world in which people can flourish, and AI is just a massive nonsense waste of everything, toxic, pointless nonsense. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's like I think it's really the people who I see. You remember when we were in Plymouth and we did the field recordings from First Performance? There was a group of like 4 or 5 teenage girls who were there,
Right.
and talking to them afterwards was really interesting. They were saying we love that. Like no one ever talks about the future. Like the future, we never talk about. Like,
Right.
and we're all
Yes.
so anxious about the
Yes.
future. And that's
Right.
the
Right.
future that we want.
Yes. And you
And
were at
like it,
Boomtown last year, weren't you? Boomtown Festival, which for people who don't know is kind of mainly 18 to 35 and 50,000 people turn up and then 500,000 people access it online. And you went to Boomtown and you transformed somebody's life.
yeah, they asked me to give. So every year the book it has a theme, and so last year the theme was built around my last book, From What Is to What If. So they said, Rob, will you come along and speak on the main stage between Damian Marley and Earth, Wind and Fire? Can you imagine? So I was backstage with Earth, Wind and Fire. If when I'm 80, if I can put it about like that, I'll be most. They've still got it. Those guys, they had all the moves. They were very impressive, and yeah. So I went out on the stage in my full time traveler's regalia, and they said, you've got 6 minutes, Rob. You can't go over 6 minutes. You've got exactly 6 minutes. So I got 5.5 minutes. I practiced it. I had it down. It was 6 minutes. I went on. I'm 5.5 minutes in, just building up to my sort of closing crescendo. And the stage manager comes on with a piece of paper and puts it in front of me, and it says, Earth, Wind, and Fire have disappeared. Keep talking. Okay.
So, oh,
All
okay,
right.
how long have I got?
Okay, so
Wow.
I said, well, normally at this stage I would say, does anyone have any questions? But you're a bit far away, and I'm not sure that's going to work. So I told a couple of stories and then left. And Earth, Wind, and Fire were all there, and I came off to Earth, Wind, and Fire going, cool, cool talk, man, which was very, very nice. But yeah, there was a lovely story. And then it was definitely one of my life memories was that I came off stage and Earth, Wind, and Fire started playing. And then I changed out of my stuff and walked around the side and into the audience to where all my kids were, because I went there with all my kids and their girlfriends. And then we all danced to Earth, Wind and Fire. And it was just one of those really special
And you out of your kit becomes a completely different person. Did anybody
exactly. But
recognize you or
then
were you incognito?
well then I was walking through and lots of people were saying, thank you, love that,
Oh,
love that.
okay, that's good. But
But
then
there
you
was a
got an email
story.
after from
Yeah, that
someone.
somebody saw a thing on Reddit or one of these things where some young lad who had smoked since he was 14 and was about 25 and had been to university and smoked and was vaping, I think, instead. But he said because I always start by saying there are many, many different futures. The future is not fixed. There is not a future. It's like Rashida Phillips never writes the word future. She always puts the words S in brackets on the end. you know. And it's like that. There are many different futures ahead of us, and some of them are horrible. We've been there in our time machine. We visited them. Believe me, they're awful. We don't want to go there. But some of them are extraordinary, and that's what I'm going to tell you about. And he said, the idea that there's a future ahead of me in which I don't vape had never occurred to me before. It wasn't there.
Wow. Right.
And then all of a sudden, when I was seeing this guy who I'd never heard of before talking about the future, the thought occurred to me so strongly that there is a future ahead of me in which I don't vape, that I threw my vape in the bin. And that
And
was it.
haven't touched it since.
And I haven't touched it since. And I thought, isn't
Yeah.
that interesting? You know, that actually you imagine if we can scale that up,
Yep. This is the
that sense
power of
of
future memories being
that's the
real
power of it.
for
Yeah.
us.
Well, I
Yes.
couldn't, that future wasn't there for me, and now it is.
Yeah. And how much that a future where you wake up in the morning and the world feels okay
Yeah.
is an option.
Yeah.
And if we can internalize that in the way that he internalized a future without vaping,
Yes, it's
then
like
we all
so
get there.
one of the stories that I talk about in the book about Utrecht and about the cycling revolution in the Netherlands, which we go there now and think, well, that's just how it always was. It was the result of massive coordinated citizen action there in the 1970s after 1 year where 400 children were killed on the roads in the Netherlands. And this movement called Stop the Child Murder started all across the
Wow.
Netherlands, which pushed for that change. But now the Dutch government invest €500 million every year in building really exemplary cycling infrastructure, like incredible cycling infrastructure,
Yeah.
and people use it. What a surprise! Who knew? But their logic is that every half they spend €500 million because their calculation is that that saves them €19 billion off the national health bill.
Right.
So it's
Right.
not an expense; it's an
Exactly.
investment.
Right.
So
And it's
what?
also, it's not that they're burning the money. I think we have to remember that when governments spend money, it cycles presumably within their local economy and they get it back as
Of
tax. We
course,
have got to reframe our use of money.
exactly. So the point is, okay, we take that thinking, right? I'm going to spend €500 million. It's going to save me 19 billion euros off the national health bill. You take that thinking and you start to expand it out, right? So we're going to be uh, um, we change our education system in a way that is much more about imagination. We're going to save a huge amount of money on mental health services because we're creating something that's good. You know, a lot of this stuff we could really
Yes.
reframe around mental health. If we
Yes.
decided we were going to actually prioritize mental well-being, that's not just about access to services and medication.
Quite.
That's about access to good housing. It's why in the book I talk about the prison abolition movement in the US, which is so wonderful because they hold that question of but what if there were no prisons? Yeah, but if there were no prisons, we'd have to have such a different kind of education system. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
keep going.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
it opens up all those other
Yes.
conversations. So if we start to think more holistic and more joined up, then bringing the biodiversity back to our cities is better for our mental health. It'll save on this, it'll save on that.
And you have clean air and you can head towards having clean water and you can begin to grow
Exactly.
food that you can actually eat because it's not covered with exhaust
If you live in
fumes.
a city where people can swim to work, which
Yes.
already happens in Munich and
Does
happens
it?
in a couple of other places,
The rivers are
there's
that clean.
people
Wow.
commute to work by swimming and they take their
Or
laptop and their dry
canoes.
clothes in a bright orange bag that floats along behind them as they swim
Ah,
along the
that's
river. And
fantastic.
then they arrive and then they get changed. You know, it's like, imagine if like that's the bit that's,
Yeah.
all these debates get stuck in kind of percentages of CO2 and costs of
Yes.
energy policy. And it's like,
Yes. Or
no, no,
Julia Hartley Brewer screaming on GB News that nobody's going to take her car away from her because it's her personal right. And
it's like,
it's
I
like,
want to hear about
guys,
the guy that swims to work.
yes.
How
Oh,
does
the
that,
cargo bike with the kids in, and the
the
kids
cargo
are
bike with the
all
kids
chatting
in?
in a silent cargo bike that the parent is pedaling in. How much better is
Exactly.
that for everybody?
And the restaurant that cooks using the heat from the sun and how that changes their relationship with the people around them and
Yeah, yes.
yeah,
And this is, we haven't said this enough. The book is full of these examples of the city that I think it's got 6 hectares where they grow all of the food. So local food cities, we talked about the bicycles and the car-free zones and the beavers. We haven't talked a lot about beavers because we talk about beavers quite a lot in the podcast, but you do have a bit about beavers and there are beavers in your soundscape and the portal to the future. We could a little bit. Give us if you step through your portal to the future to, let's say, Totnes, because that's where you live. Beautiful little town in Devon. I would give my eye teeth to be living near it, but hey.
You're
Um,
always welcome.
oh yes, we'd have to shift many grandchildren that far south. What does it look like? Give us an audio vision of, let's say we got to 2040, because it gives you another decade to embed all of the changes. Give us Rob's version of you're waking up in Totnes 2040 and we've done everything we possibly could.
Mm. I think the first thing that you notice is how much quieter it is. That sort of background growl of the internal combustion engine has long since gone. So we hear the world in more detail. We hear more richness as we walk around. Like if you walk down the streets, you can hear people having piano lessons in their house. You can hear knives and forks on plates, which you couldn't do before. The air smells so much cleaner. Like if you had the nose of a sommelier, you would be picking out particular herbs, particular trees, particular things. And every step you take opens up new sort of smells. But the thing that strikes you the most, I think, is there's a kind of a look in people's eyes. There's a, that kind of cynicism, the despondency, the sort of individualism that we saw in people back in 2025 has been replaced by a kind of a shared sense of purpose and a sense of excitement. There's this sense of, I think we might just do this. And actually, these last 15 years have been absolutely exhilarating. I think I feel like although in 2025 all the visions of the future that we were given in magazines and from Silicon Valley were all about tech, I think that in that 2040, we've seen a real move away from a lot of digital tech. Social media, people don't really use it so much anymore because it just got so boring. And a lot of internet-based things people don't use. So people have really kind of embraced analog things much more. People meet rather than people meet in person. Um, the most towns and cities have very actively built what they call a food belt around them now. So that connection between the settlements and the land around them, which had largely broken down by the 1950s, has been rebuilt. And a lot of young people now aspire to be involved in kind of intensive market gardening, growing mushrooms, producing really quirky, interesting things for local consumption. In 2025, you could visit cities all around the world and you could drink Heineken and eat at Wagamama's or McDonald's, and wherever you were in the world, that food tasted exactly the same. Part of the beauty in that 2040 is if you're in Totnes, you get the bus to Newton Abbot, you're tasting and drinking things that you can only taste in that place. A bit like when you went to Italy in 2025 and you went to one village who would tell you their olive oil was the best in the world. And the stuff in the next village, you wouldn't even wash your car with it. And then you go to that next village and they're like, oh, and it's like that kind of culture has started to come back. I think people work less, but they work more meaningfully. People and democracy is not just something we do every 4 years. It's something we're involved in more cooperatives. We're involved in more buildings and businesses in our towns that are in community ownership. We're also, I think, one of the most important things is that in that 2040, we're now uh, 12 years into the establishment of uh, a free Gaza state and the rebuilding of Gaza, and that was accompanied by such by a focus by the rest of the world's powers on the importance of peacemaking as being so much more important and so much more of a skill than starting wars. And the addressing of that issue, which had been such a kind of weeping sore in the world for like 50 years and had just caused so much instability, the fact that the world got people to sit down with that and really, and around the founding of a free Palestine was such a had such a kind of healing effect that like the impact of that just rippled out in a way that felt totally unimaginable in 2025. um yeah, so it's a world that feels more peaceful but more grounded, and people feel more connected to where they are. And I think one of the main things is that we don't see in that 2040 anywhere like the extremes of wealth and poverty saw back in 2025. That those, one of the things that I remember that was I loved from during that time, because you can kind of look back and see there were key things that shifted it. And one of them was actually when Cristiano Ronaldo retired as a footballer in 2026, when he retired sort of wealthier than some small countries from having played football all that time, that he decided to channel a lot of his money into kickstarting the transition, particularly in Portugal, where he was from. And he recognized that the government was not installing renewables in the way that it needed to be. And he personally kickstarted the renewable energy revolution across Portugal. And because it was him, it kind of just took off. And so there was a lot of people who had a public profile who used that public profile to tell a different story because they could see how important these times were. But I still just remember those photographs of Cristiano Ronaldo standing in front of football stadiums covered in solar panels, and how that then started to really kind of spread very, very quickly through the national consciousness.
Fantastic. Okay. In that case, all we have to do is make it happen. And to do that, everybody needs to go and buy your book at
Do
any place
please.
that is not the giant vampire squid wrapped around the face of humanity.
No,
Although, having bought it somewhere else, you need to go and leave a review on the giant vampire squid wrapped around the face of humanity, because still,
sadly.
sadly, our publishers and everybody else goes and looks there to see how many 5-star reviews there are. So please, everybody, go and buy Rob's book. There will be links in the show notes, but buy it from your local bookstore and or somewhere like Hive Online that then gives money to your local bookstore, please.
Very
But
good.
then go and give a review on Amazon. You've also recorded the audiobook, haven't you?
I have.
So if people want to listen to the audiobook, that'll be out as well. And you can listen to that on your podcast provider, I discover.
You will, and you will also hear my very, very impressive Danish pronunciation of some key names and places that I practiced for a long time to sound
Yay. To
Danish.
sound superly Danish. Fantastic. There's a lot of other words that I don't quite know how to pronounce in there. Lots of names of people from all around the world who are doing amazing and exciting
Yeah,
things. So,
yeah.
yay. What next for you? Besides, we're going to take Field Recordings from the Future on a tour, and we're going to
We're
set up a
going to do that.
utopian convergence, you and me.
We are doing some amazing things together, which is
Oh,
very, very
so
exciting.
exciting.
And thank you to the visionary funders who recognize the potential in enabling
In
us
a
to do that.
collaboration, yes.
Exactly. I think that field recordings from the future is going to be a big part of the next year of my life. It's like rolling that out in a way that has the most impact possible. I'm also just starting work with an amazing Belgian cartoonist on a comic book, which is the story of how me and Mr. Kit built a time machine and traveled to 2030 and collected all those
It's like
recordings.
Tintin for the future.
It's like Tintin for the future, because actually part of the reason why Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are such idiots and all this stupid stuff about we're going to go and live on Mars is because of the comic books that they read
They
when they
read when they
were
were
kids.
kids.
So
Yes.
we need comic books now that are full of beavers and mushrooms and
Yes.
bicycles and stuff. So we've
Yes.
just started work on that. That'll come out next year.
Exciting.
And I've been working with a guy to build, when we were kids and we'd go to the seaside and you'd have those predict your future machines where you put in a
Yes.
coin. So we're doing a sort of field recordings from a future version of that, where it'll print out a future for you.
Can I tell you something just very briefly? One of the factoids that I learned when I was a historical writer, the Romans invented steam power, but because they only had wood to power it, it wasn't actually as good as having slaves do all your work. But the thing they used it for was that you would go into the temple of various deities that were supposed to record the future, and you'd put your token that the priests and the priestesses gave you into the machine. It would go hiss, clink, click, and it would spit out a thing that was your future, and that was all they
Wow.
used steam power for.
Wow. I need to find
That
those.
needs to be in there somewhere, doesn't
I
it?
need one of those. I need one of those. Yeah. So basically, well, what I love as well is I have no idea what's going to happen, and I love that I'm able to have the sort of freedom and flexibility now to
To
do
make the
lots of
future
talks and
happen.
workshops, but also to have a bit of time and space to kind of plot new, exciting things. In my wildest dreams, we would be looking at by the end of next year, the field recordings from the future comic book will be an
A number
animated
one. Yes, a
film,
film. Yes.
and that actually we would have all sorts of different interesting artists who would be remixing our field recordings from the future tracks, and people would be out making their own field recordings from the
And
future.
it's a number one on the album charts. Do the album charts even still exist? That's that
They
thing?
do, they do. Yeah, but we're
Okay.
not putting it on Spotify because Spotify are pretty evil, and
Oh, okay.
we're
Another
gonna
giant
it'll,
vampire squid.
another
Okay.
job. So
Very good.
Bandcamp, you can find it on Bandcamp. Yeah,
Okay. Excellent. Right. And then we'll invite you back onto the podcast. But in the meantime, Rob Hopkins
anytime.
of Everything Amazing About the Future and with your wonderful new book on field recordings from the future and how to fall in love with the future. Thank you for coming onto the podcast.
And thank you so much for inviting me and all the wonderful things you do. And let's do some amazing things together.
We shall. Yes, watch this space. Thank you.
Absolutely.